You know the destiny of S1 in the analytic discourse when the analysand is hystericized. The analytic discourse gets a quarter turn back, and now you have an analysand occupying the discourse of the hysteric. But check out this S1, this monad, in the discourse of the analyst. From the henad that is S2 as unconscious, to the nad of barred subjectivity, who then coughs up the monad of S1 as symptom, there is a return arrow from S1 up to the analyst. This is the other destiny of the monad in analytic experience, and it's precisely here that brings Lacan to the end of Seminar 19. Now, what do we know about the agency of the analyst as depicted in the analytic discourse? Well, it has two inputs. There's S2 as the position of truth, which conditions the agency of the analyst. Here is knowledge of the truth of the unconscious, as we've discussed it so many times in recent series. Now, we know that's not all that S2 means, because it, as unconscious truth, conditions the barred subject as well. But relative to the analyst, we can just refer to this S2 as knowledge of the truth of the unconscious. But this isn't the only input into the production of analytic agency. There's also this S1 in the discourse of the analyst, the symptom that has a return arrow pointed up toward the analyst in the position of agent. The S1 here is the specific symptomatic expression of a specific analysand, repeated again and again, encore. How are we to handle these two inputs? One from the knowledge of the truth of the unconscious as S2, and the other from the specific symptomatic expressions of particular analysands, S1. These two come together in the position of the analyst. What are we to make of them? Well, my understanding, reading Lacan here, is that the analyst has two choices. The first choice, not too good. The analyst can choose to subordinate the symptom to their so-called knowledge about how symptoms work. In other words, the analyst's S2 can be allowed to trump the analysand's S1. This is a decision that an analyst can make. Their knowledge of the truth of the unconscious, this knowledge they believe they have, let's just add that as an important footnote here, is allowed to trump or determine the relevance and the significance of specific symptomatic expressions, of specific analysands. In brief, what we would be talking about here is a structure in which S2 trumps S1. The analyst's knowledge dominates the analysand's symptom. Does this sound familiar to you? It damn sure oughta. It's another way to read the university discourse. Here as an elusive regression from that of the analyst. What looks like progress, a quarter turn clockwise in the analytic discourse, is anything but. The discourse of the university is not a progression in analytic experience. It is in fact an elusive regression. I'll draw it once again. You've seen it probably 100 times, but here is the university discourse that I'm holding up for you. And what I'm calling your attention to is the way in the university discourse S2 trumps S1, the way that S2 sits atop S1. It's a different way to read the university discourse. Here, I believe, when S2 is allowed to trump S1, the analyst remains stalled out in and as a figure of knowledge, and one in particular, the subject supposed to know. And the enigmatic, elusive, wildly ulterior aspects of the symptom, they get suppressed, reduced to mere illustrations, idle confirmations of whatever the fuck the analyst thinks they already know about how the unconscious works. I think that this is a significant problem. I think what we see here is an obscene double, and not in the good way, of the learned ignorance that Lacan advocates for analysts. Here, what you would see when the analytic discourse twists into the university discourse is you see true ignorance, shrouded in false intelligence, and all in the position of the analyst. Oh, but it's just so fucking tempting. Think about it, dear analysts. You've read so many books. You've got so many books in your office, so many Lacan books. There's just so much knowledge here. Oh, it's just so tempting to let that S2 run the show, to let your supposed knowledge of how the unconscious works be the guiding force in whether and to what extent a specific utterance from an analysand gets attention. Now, I don't mean to pick on you all, but that is precisely what Lacan is doing at the end of Seminar 19. And yet in a very gentle way. It is so tempting, Lacan believes, for analysts to play professor. And he says this right up until the very end of our Seminar 19. He understands this temptation. He understands the analyst's temptation to play professor in the clinic. In fact, what he says is, and I quote, "It's only too understandable." But Lacan also sees it as a kind of resistance, and this is the key point, because it is arguably the definitive resistance of analytic experience itself. It is the resistance of the analyst. You've heard Lacan cue this up. Early Lacan, he's very explicit about this shit. If there's some resistance in analysis, it does not belong to the analysand. The defining resistance of analytic experience to be overcome is that of the analyst. What is this resistance that we see playing out when the analyst is tempted to be a professor in the clinic? Lacan says at the end of Seminar 19, page 194, that it is a resistance to truly fulfilling one's function as analyst. A function, he says, that is inscribed in the position one occupies as objet A in the analytic discourse. So Lacan thinks that what we're talking about here is a resistance to the position of objet A in the analytic discourse. If S2 in the university discourse shows the analyst playing professor and thus stalled out in the position of the subject supposed to know, little a in the analytic discourse shows them at the other end of things, not as the subject supposed to know, but, hear me now, as the object supposed to go. Now that little rhyme ought to cue up for you some work that we've already done on this topic. The stages of the analyst's development would begin with them as a subject supposed to know. But if they stay there, it marks a significant failure of analysis, I would suggest. One in which analysis becomes more like the classroom. However, a good analyst is one who moves from the subject supposed to know through a series of stages, Lacan says, and ultimately arrives in a very specific position, that of objet A, not as a subject supposed to know, but objet A as an object supposed to go. And one place more than other, the fucking trash can. Recall, if you will, the 5 stages of the analyst that we developed in our series on Seminar 17 and have been referring to really ever since. If you've got pen and paper, you can write down the 5 stages with a series of letters. From big A to big barred A to little a1, little a2, and finally little a3. These are the 5 stages. That big A marks the subject supposed to know. Here is the analyst as big other. Here is the analyst as S2, as professor. Here is the psychotherapist sitting there listening as they thumb through the DSM. The barred big A is an important transition from, an important fall, Lacan says, from this position of subject supposed to know. Here you're still a big other, but you're a big barred other, a lacking other, an other who doesn't have all the answers, who has to close the DSM and say, doesn't seem like we found a characterological abnormality to describe this. I don't know how that shit's gonna work. I ain't that kind of doctor, mind you. The importance, though, here is it's a fall from being the whole big other as a treasure trove in which all the answers are contained, a big A, to being a barred big A, one in which not all the answers are contained. Next on the list is this little a1. Here you would see the analyst, as you know, appearing as a desirous subject, causing the analysand to wonder, what do they want from me? What am I supposed to be doing in here? I talked about my dream last week, and I told you it wasn't about my mother, and we thought it was a big breakthrough. And now you don't want to talk about my dreams. What the fuck do you want, analyst? Here is the analyst as an enigmatic, desirous subject. But check it out. This little a1 gives way to a 4th moment, little a2, where through whatever sort of artistry, the analysand starts to wonder, not about the desire of the analyst, but about their own. Why do I care what the analyst may or may not want from me? Why do I give a fuck if they want to hear my dreams or not? What is it about me that is so hung up on their desire? That's little a2, as you know. Which brings us to the important one, the object supposed to go, the one that is in clear focus at the end of Seminar 19 and in ways that made me smile numerous times. The little a3, the 5th moment in the development of a Lacanian analyst, and there are going to be others, my friends. Don't get it twisted. I ain't that kind of doctor. I'm just reading Lacan and telling you what he spits out here. He's got this vision of an analyst that arrives at a certain identity depicted in the discourse of the analyst. And I'm telling you what that little a is. It's the little a3 that I'm about to remind you of. Here is the analyst as refuse, as waste, as object supposed to go. This is the point in analytic experience where the analysand would be able to say things like, I don't need this motherfucker or these sessions to do the work that I'm doing right now. It could be that. It could be 100 other things. But Lacan thinks this is a crucial, if not paramount, position in analytic experience for the analyst to occupy. This position of the stone to be cast aside, refuse to be placed in the trash can, waste to be removed, an object supposed to go. Here, the analyst is not a subject supposed to know. They're a piece of shit. What Lacan here literally calls a piece of crap that is an object supposed to go, and one place more than any other, in the trash. At the end of Seminar 19, Lacan has his eye on each end of this analytic spectrum, big A and little a3, the subject supposed to know and the object supposed to go. And the discourse in which each position positions the analyst. If the analyst embraces their initial status as the big other, as this S2, this keeper of all characterological abnormality knowledge, they occupy the university discourse. Here is your analyst playing professor. Analyst becomes teacher, analysand becomes student, and the knowledge of the former is allowed to trump the symptoms of the latter. Here is that S2 over S1, and here is the fucking trap. However, there is a way out. If, however, the analyst overcomes this temptation to play professor, allowing themselves to fall from the position of the subject supposed to know, they begin heading toward the analytic discourse. Not the university discourse, but the analytic discourse, and ultimately toward the agency of a certain objet A, an object little a that Lacan now reconceptualizes as abject little a. It's a crucial term at the end of Seminar 19, made explicit in Lacan's subsequent report on Seminar 19. Abject little a. That's what the little a stands for. It stands for abject little a when it comes to the analyst. And this abject little a, my friends, is the final one of Seminar 19. Notice how Lacan gets here. It almost seems to occur by accident. He's talking about sleep. And he says to sleep is not to be disturbed. And the point he's making is that sleep is this place where you do not experience jouissance. It's kind of a ridiculous point, and somebody seems to think as much, because someone in the audience then shouts out, "A pollution!" presumably in reference to nocturnal emissions. You're telling me sleep doesn't have jouissance? Explain to me nocturnal emissions then. And Lacan is like, exactly. And he says, this is precisely the difficulty of the analytic discourse. And it's at this point, finally, in this final lecture, that we can crack the book. The page in question is the one I just mentioned. It's page 194. And it's great stuff. Pollution, exactly. And I quote, this is precisely the difficulty of the analytic discourse. Lacan says, I'm picking up on this interruption, seizing on it, taking on board something that, in the urgency of the end of the year, I find myself having occasion to say. It is precisely insofar as the analytic discourse is characterized by locating the objet A in the place of semblance, this upper left-hand quadrant of the discourse of the analyst, that, can you imagine, sir, thinking you'd pulled quite a stunt, he says to the person who blurted out. You've gone exactly in the direction of what I have to put forward, namely, that the pollution that is most characteristic in this world is the object little a, from which man takes his substance, you included. And having to turn himself in his body, in his existence as an analyst, into the representation of this pollution, which is the most certain effect across the surface of the globe, he has to take more than one look at this. It's made the little darlings ill, and I must tell you that I'm no more at ease in this situation than they are. Becoming abject little a is not an easy place to be. Lacan continues. What I'm trying to demonstrate to them is that it's not entirely impossible to do so with a little decency. Thanks to logic, if they would kindly allow themselves to be tempted by it, I've managed to make this position bearable for them, the position that they occupy as little a in the analytic discourse. It would allow them to conceive of how raising this function to a position of semblance, which is the key position in any discourse, is clearly no small matter. Here lies the mainspring of what I have always been trying to make you feel as the analyst's resistance, which is only too understandable, to truly fulfilling his function, a function to be fulfilled, recall, by turning himself in his body, in his existence as an analyst, into the representation of this pollution. First passage to get us going, and it ain't bad. Lacan goes on, as you recall, to define the analyst, qua little a, as, check it out, a deserted being, by dint of being the support, the refuse, the abjection, there's the word, onto which can be hooked what will, thanks to us, be begotten by the fact of saying. Namely, what he means here is the analysand as interpretant. But all of that turns on the ability of the analyst to overcome their resistance to showing up as a deserted being, nothing more than the corporal bodily support, the refuse, the abjection onto which interpretation can be hooked. Very important passage. It's from page 210. You can check it out. On this point, Lacan is explicit, and on the very next page, 211, he spills the beans. The analysand analyzes with this piece of crap that is proposed to him in the figure of the analyst, the object little a. The analysand, hystericized and otherwise, does the work of analysis with this piece of crap that is the analyst. And again, to reiterate, Lacan is hammering on this point as well. In his subsequent report on Seminar 19, here's what he says. As little a, the analyst becomes a being of abjection. It's page 216. Check it out. And make no mistake in so doing. The first two little a's, you'll recall, in our 5-part development of the analyst, they are object little a's in the traditional sense. The first, that little a1, points to the desire of the analyst. And the second, that little a2, refers to that of the analysand. What do they want from me in the first, that little a1? And then, why do I fucking care in the second, that little a2? But the third and final little a in this sequence is not object little a. Instead, it is abject little a. Not a cause of desire, and certainly not an object of desire either, but a figure of pollution, a bit of refuse, or as Lacan puts it here, a piece of crap. That is what little a3 means. That is the position of analyst as little a in the discourse of the analyst. It is analyst as piece of crap. And Lacan has been explicit about this since Seminar 17. This is agent as refuse. Yet another reason why Lacan titled this seminar or worse. When analysts, he says, cannot accustom themselves to being promoted as abjection, this is what he writes in his report, they take an imperious turn for the worse. Page 216. When they can, however, accustom themselves to being promoted as abjection, there is much to be gained. What happens when the analyst can overcome their resistance to being that piece of crap with which the analysand does their work? Well, Knowledge, in this case, remains in the position of truth. Just look at the discourse of the analyst. Knowledge as S2 remains in that position of truth. It's not the agency in analytic experience. It occupies a hidden position of truth. It remains there. And because it remains in the position of truth, knowledge about the truth of the unconscious, for instance, remains subject to interrogation, revelation, and revision, and all in light of the analysand's symptomatic expressions, just as we've been discussing it in this series. The analysand's symptoms, when the analyst can overcome their resistance to being a piece of shit, allow for holes in the analyst's knowledge to be opened up, blasted open. And together, they allow these holes, these arcades in knowledge, to result in new theory, new knowledge, new understandings, and a whole hell of a lot of learned ignorance along the way. Lacan refers to this as also allowing for something crucial, namely on page 208, a bit of a push in the direction of interpreting. The analysand's symptoms blast holes in the analyst's knowledge, and together they allow the latter to give the former a bit of a push in the direction of interpreting. Here, at long last, I think we can begin to account for the arrow of addressivity pointing from analyst to analysand, abject little a to barred subjectivity in the analytic discourse, this top arrow, where you see abject little a addressing the barred subject. It is a knowledge, truth, and symptom-infused nudge toward interpretation. Rewind that shit, play it again. This arrow of addressivity is a nudge infused with truth, symptom, and knowledge toward interpretation. This is the nudge, the bit of a push in the direction of interpreting that Lacan suggests. As abject little a, that nudge can be given. And isn't this precisely what we see in the discourse of the hysteric? When the analysand enters into it? Yeah, it's the analyst as abject little a that we see in the position of truth, cause, condition of the hystericized analysand's agential possibility. Bruce Fink, again, has a good riff on this. He says this is analyst as motor force. The same way that whatever appears in that lower left-hand quadrant of Lacan's discourse is going to be the motor force or the cause that conditions the agent's ability to speak, address another, which in turn results in the production of something, an effect. The cause of any given discourse is shown in the lower left, as we know. And here you might think of this as the analyst as piece of shit. That is somehow the cause at the level of a nudge, a little bit of a push that gets the analysand and keeps the analysand associating. However, I believe there is more to all of this than knowledge, truth, symptom, and even interpretation. When analysts overcome their resistance to abjection, they become brothers and sisters of their analysands in two important ways. And this bit on brothers and sisters is also all over Lacan's final thoughts on Seminar 19. Again, I'm not just choosing this shit randomly. First and foremost, when the analyst can overcome their resistance to being a piece of crap, they can accept that they are son and daughter of discourse, and bound accordingly to the barred subjectivities that walk through their door. This emphasis on binding is really key. It's a word that keeps coming up in Lacan's materials at the end of Seminar 19. There's a certain binding that occurs between analyst and analysand, when the analyst can be the piece of crap that Lacan thinks they need to be. They can be sons and daughters of discourse, like all of us, castrated, like all of us, barred, like so many of us. You get the idea here. This is exactly where our boy ends Seminar 19. And I believe it is absolutely deserving of a close, careful reading. I'm on page 211 of the English translation that we've been rocking, reading the passage that you've already heard me quote from, but this time in full, because it's so great in capturing this type of binding, sibling connection that happens when we can admit that we are all, analyst and analysand alike, sons and daughters of discourse. What is begotten by an analysis? What is begotten at the level of the subject who speaks, of the analysand, is something that happens with, emphasis on with. Man thinks, says Aristotle, with his soul. The analysand analyzes with this piece of crap that is proposed to him in the figure of the analyst, the objet turned abject, little a, we're adding. It is with this something, this split thing, that must be begotten what is none other, when all is said and done, to take up something that was put forward the other day with respect to purse, than the beam by which the scales of what is called justice can be set in balance. Our brother transfigured, our sister transfigured, is what is begotten by the analytic conjuration. And this is what binds us to the one who is improperly called our patient. Two key points as we edge toward a conclusion of our own. First, notice the with structure emphasized in this passage you just heard me read from page 211. It is with the analyst as piece of crap that the analysand proceeds. So the analyst may be a piece of shit, but they're a useful piece of shit, Lacan is suggesting. And don't stop here. At the level of instrumentality, recall the with structure we discussed in our series on Seminar 16, in our riffs on the drive, more than any other. It is mit Dasein, being there with, that defines analytic experience when the analyst embraces abjection. So I'm fucking with a Heidegger term. You've heard it before, especially if you tuned into our series on Seminar 16. I'm talking about mit Dasein. Mit meaning with in German, Sein meaning being, and da meaning here and there and maybe a little in between. Mit Dasein means being there with. And what I'm telling you is that the emphatic use of with in this passage, the analysand working with this piece of crap, gives us a leg up on the type of relationality that is occurring when these brothers and sisters, all sons and daughters of discourse, find themselves bound together in analytic experience. It is mit Dasein, being there with, that defines this bind, that defines analytic experience as a bind and also as a conjuration, as we shall see, but only insofar as the analyst embraces abjection. It is on you, dear analyst. All of which, I would say, is probably excellent training for the analysand, who at the end of analysis is able to sit with their own abjection, with their own irreducible lack, the lack that they are. Think back to our series on the drive and comments on that thereafter. Their ability, in other words, to sit with their own little abject A. Where your piece of crap analyst was, my friends, your piece of crap self can truly become. And believe it or not, this is a good thing. Which brings us to the second key point in all this. Lacan puts it well here. Our brothers and sisters transfigured. Transfiguration, as you know, is a highly technical term, and one that folks have been fighting over for quite a long time. So I'll keep it brief. Transfiguration is what happens when ashes burst into flames. The brothers and sisters transfigured, this is what happens when they, as ash, burst into flame. If the hystericized analysand is a split subject alight, burning from one association to the next, the analysand at the end of analysis is a split subject reborn from the ashes of this hystericized process. Analysand turned phoenix. This is what the analytic conjuration begets when the analyst overcomes their resistance to abjection. Which got me thinking about the end of Seminar 19. Not the end of Seminar 19, but some of the shit in the back of the book. Noticeably, the Bosch painting. Did you see this one? If you've got the English translation, flip back to those glossy pages that feel so good between your fingers. One is of a Bosch painting. It's called The Conjurer. When Lacan talks about analytic conjuration, as you heard him say, does he mean that the analyst, qua piece of crap, becomes a conjurer? Absolutely not. Recall where he brings up this Bosch painting at the start of his final lesson in Seminar 19. That's the reason why it's included at the end. The same lesson whose final passage we were just reading. Analytic experience is not a matter of hey presto, in which sleights of hand take place without material supports. If psychoanalysis is a kind of conjuration, it is one with certain material supports which are anything but hidden, much as the cups and balls of Bosch's conjuration are on full display. Take a look at the painting. Notice how Lacan cues it up at the start of his final lesson. It's about those cups and balls, my friend. What then are our cups and balls? What are the cups and balls of analytic conjuration? With this question, I think we arrive at the concluding theme of Seminar 19 yet again. And with it, that of this lecture series. The concluding theme, to put it in some words, is the speaking body. There are your cups and balls. If the mantra of the hystericized analysand is, know thyself, the goal of analysis is to come to terms with the locus and the limits of this endeavor, with the cups and balls of one's own body. Your body is the locus and the limit of your cognizance, especially when it is cognizance of oneself at the level of that Delphic maxim, to know thyself, that so many people think is the warp and woof of Lacanian psychoanalysis. That is also absolutely not the case. It's important to learn about oneself, but the idea that you could capture the unconscious in knowledge is all part of the same trap when we think that analysis culminates in hystericization and endless dialectizations of symptoms relative to the unconscious truths that command them. Let's back this up with a passage. It's a good one. It's on page 199 of the English translation and extends up to the top of 200. It's elusive, but pay attention to the role of the body in all of this. Let's speak no more of cognizance, Lacan says, because man's relation to a world of his own, obviously this is where we've been starting off from for a long while now, has never been anything but play acting in the service of the discourse of the master. The only world of one's own is the world that the master strings along at his beck and call. As for this famous knowing thyself, and Lacan throws the Greek up so you know exactly what he's referring to, which is what supposedly maketh the man, let's take as our point of departure the following, which is straightforward and palpable. Indeed, if you so wish, cognizance has a locus. It has the locus of the body. The cognizance of oneself is hygiene. Let this be our starting point. So, throughout the centuries, illnesses continued to exist. Everyone knows that illness cannot be remedied by hygiene. There is illness, and this is indeed something that grips the body. For centuries, illness was something of which doctors were supposed to have cognizance. During one of our recent talks, I think I briefly underscored the failure of these two angles. All of this is plain to see in history. It's spread across it in all sorts of aberrations. So, what's Lacan talking about here? He's saying that just as hygiene is insufficient to prevent illness, in other words, you can be as hygienic as you want and you're still going to fucking get sick. It happens. Just as hygiene is insufficient to prevent illness 100% of the time, knowledge of oneself, cognizance, always falls short and fails to capture at the level of 100% the body in which it is supposedly housed. So also with the analyst's knowledge. The real, irreducible corporality of analytic experience always exceeds the analyst's knowledge of the truth of the unconscious. Corporality in excess of knowledge, even and especially when knowledge appears in the position of truth. Think about that. Beyond and beneath the S1s and the S2s of analytic experience, there is a material support, indeed a structure, Lacan repeatedly says, a structure that Lacan calls a matter of the body, and with it a host of what he goes on to describe as radical meanings on which we have no purchase, meanings which remain essentially, as he puts it on page 202, ungraspable. The next passage for us to consider comes on page 203. It's quick, it's dirty, and I love it. After everything I've just set out concerning jouissance, truth, semblance, and surplus jouissance, so the four basic quadrants of any given discourse, there is this support, which is what happens at the level of the body, and from which all meaning emerges, but in a non-constituted form. This is what forms the ground. Let me ask you then, the ground of what? Well, I just told you, of all speaking and meaning in and beyond analysis. And this is a ground that is all too often tread upon and forgotten whenever we speak, think we mean, and think we understand the meaning of someone else's speech. This ground of the body is all too often forgotten in each of these activities. Hence, I believe the epigraph on the blackboard at the start of this final lesson in Seminar 19. And also, mind you, it was on the blackboard of the lesson just before it. And oh, guess what? This epigraph also appears at the start of Lacan's subsequent written work, arguably his most significant in the later Lacan, L'Étourdi. It also shows up again in Seminar 20. This is not some idle bumper sticker that he is putting on the blackboard. You can check it out. It's on page 197, and you can find it in all the other places I just mentioned. It goes like this. It appears in French. Here I offer a translation that I think is accurate and also serviceable. The fact of speaking, the fact that one says, remains forgotten behind what is said in what is understood. That's how I read the French on page 197. I would encourage you to read it the same. Beyond, beneath, behind, that's what's up here. Beyond, beneath, and behind what we say and understand is the fact that we speak, which Lacan goes on to say at the end of his report on Seminar 19 in this volume we're considering. He calls it the one fact of saying. In other words, the one of the body that speaks. Here is a one of the body that speaks. But check it out. This is not the body of the proverbial father of the primal horde who alone enjoys all the blah, 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 blah. This is not a body alone. The one fact of saying, the one of the body that speaks, that is all too often forgotten, this is never a body alone. Even if their jouissance is always a J1, all alone. This is a body that itself is not alone. I call your attention to page 201, just a couple before the passage we just read. We still have to pay attention when we say that it's the body, Lacan says. It's not necessarily one body. From the moment we take jouissance as the starting point, this means very precisely that the body is not on its own, that there is another one. It is not because of this that jouissance is sexual, since what I've just been explaining this year is that the least one can say is that this jouissance is not brought along. It's the jouissance of, check it out, a bodily one-on-one. The one at the end of Seminar 19, when the analyst can overcome their resistance to abjection, is indeed a bodily one-on-one. What is specific to jouissance is that when there are two bodies, and even more so when there are more of them, naturally one cannot tell which of them is enjoying. Because remember, jouissance as a bodily intensification, that is always a J1. That is always a private jouissance. It can radiate speech, meanings, grunts, groans, and the like. But that experience of jouissance is hardwired for privacy. It's for this reason that there might be several bodies involved in this affair, and even series of bodies. So this body that is beyond, beneath, and behind what we say, this fact that we speak, the one of the body that speaks, it ain't a body all alone, even if that's precisely how it enjoys. Let me ask you, as we near the end of our time together with Seminar 19, what is the analyst when they overcome their resistance to abjection? A body. And what is the analysand when they embrace their barred subjectivity? A body. And what then is analytic experience as a conjuration in which cup and ball alike are on full display? It is an encounter of bodies. You want to know what makes analytic discourse work? It is not the analyst's knowledge or the analysand's symptoms, but the lived corporal encounter between two mortal and wonderfully mortified bodies, an abject little a and a no less castrated speaking subject. And if you don't believe me, check out page 204. The body is again what Lacan is talking about. When someone comes to see me for the first time in my consulting room, and I punctuate our entry into this business with a few preliminary consultations, what is important is the confrontation of bodies. It's precisely because it starts with this encounter of bodies, that once one enters the analytic discourse, there will be no further question of this. It is still the case, however, that on the level at which discourse functions, which is not the analytic discourse, the question arises as to how this discourse has managed to capture bodies. From start to finish, analytic experience is an encounter, a confrontation of bodies. Ungraspable, non-constituted, radical meanings on which we have no purchase, Lacan tells us. What do we call meanings of this sort? Meanings that radiate from the corporal material supports of analytic experience known as two bodies. They are real meanings. They are meanings of the real. To say and be understood is to speak. Just think about this. And to speak is to have a body. And to have a body, indeed, to be a body, is to enact sayings and meanings that far exceed, to the point of inaccessibility, nay, impossibility, what is said and what is understood. And that's the key point here. The sayings and meanings embodied in analytic experience far exceed, to the point of impossibility, what is said and presumably understood in analytic experience. Make no mistake, the analytic discourse, more than any of its siblings, is designed to help us account for these excesses in all of their impossibility. And this, according to Lacan, is all he's been up to in Seminar 19. Hilarious. I love this. This is all he's been doing, he says. Check it out. It's on page 197. I've continued to circumscribe this impossibility, in which, for us in the analytic discourse, everything that can be founded as real is gathered. He's not going to sum up what he did, but he's going to tell you, if he had to, he might say that what he did was he continued to circumscribe a certain impossibility, in which, for us in the analytic discourse, everything that can be founded as real is gathered. Final words. Then we're out, as always. And I hesitate to even go this far. I don't want to, swerve too far out of my lane, but I can't resist when Lacan's queuing the shit up like this. Whether everything you've just heard in the past 2 lectures in this series allows for something like a Lacanian psychoanalysis, whether it comports with something like Lacanian psychoanalysis, whether every passage I've read for you from Seminar 19 comports with what you understand Lacanian psychoanalysis to be. Here's the wager. All of that shit depends on analysts, and on one aspect of their practice more than any other. It's the same one we've been discussing, namely their resistance to abjection, to becoming that deserted piece of shit. And not just once and for all, but again and again, with each and every barred subject who walks through their door. The analyst must overcome that resistance to abjection. At the end of Seminar 19, and in profound anticipation of things to come, Lacan gives us a phrase for this commitment to overcoming resistance to abjection. Listen up, dear analysts, to be and otherwise. That phrase is pronounced encore, except it's written E-N space corpse, C-O-R-P-S. But it sounds a lot like encore. Again and again, with each session, again and again, this resistance must be overcome. But that's a little fuzzy, so let me try and end with a bit of clarity. In order for the clinical practice of Lacanian psychoanalysis to flourish, analysts must find their place in the analytic discourse, and they must do so in core. Final passage, and then it's time to say goodbye, just for a minute. It's on page 206, damn near at the end of things. And it's a stone cold piece of Lacan. If I am to be believed, it must be thought that it is indeed as I have said it is, namely, that the analyst installs the objet a, and does so in core, with all the legitimate ambiguity of this term, in the place of semblance. It is on account of this that something exists that is called the analytic discourse. Encore means in body. In body, the analyst must show up as a body, and not just any body, but a body that is abject, an abject body. That is the position, the proper position of the analyst, Lacan is suggesting. And it's not something that you just ace and you're good to go. Like an encore, it has to occur again and again. It is the measure and the test of one's analytic chops, Lacan is suggesting. In body, in person, again and again, encore. And now more than ever, I would suggest, in today's highfalutin teletherapy age, being there with someone in time and space alike, mit da sein, matters more, not less, in the age of Zoom. All the more reason, I think, to look forward to Seminar 20, the next seminar that we're going to discuss. What is the title of Seminar 20? What is the proper title of Seminar 20? It is not on feminine sexuality. It is not on the limits of love and knowledge. The proper title is the very phrase you just heard, encore.